deep in the unforgiving sub-zero wilderness of the Spingar Mountains. A single drop of blood on fresh snow tells a story of survival, betrayal, and an unbreakable bond. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Bramlett, a seasoned Navy SEAL, was the sole survivor of a compromised mission. Hunted, freezing, and outgunned, his only chance at survival came when he stumbled upon a blood trail that didn't belong to a human. It belonged to a 90-pound, highly trained tactical German shepherd named Titan. But as the blizzard raged and the enemy closed in, Daniel discovered this wasn't just a rescue mission. The dog held a secret that was about to turn the entire United States military apparatus upside down. The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush sounded like a choir of the damned. It was 22 degrees below zero, and the blizzard showed no signs of breaking. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Bramlett, a 14-year veteran of SEAL Team 6, forced his legs to keep moving through the waist-deep powder. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. His Malk 18 rifle hung heavy against his chest, the metal freezing cold even through his tactical gloves. Operation Avalanche had been a catastrophic failure. A routine high-value target extraction had turned into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Someone had known exactly where their MH-60 Blackhawk was going to land. The RPG had taken out the tail rotor before the skids even touched the ice. Daniel had been thrown clear into a snowbank just seconds before the fuselage became a twisted inferno of metal and jet fuel. His comms were dead. His squad was gone. And he was being hunted. As Daniel crested a steep, wind-scoured ridge, his tactical training kicked in, scanning the blinding white terrain for any anomaly. That was when he saw it, a stark crimson smear against the pristine white snow. Daniel dropped to one knee, instantly leveling his optic downrange. He held his breath, scanning the tree line of skeletal pines 100 yards away. Nothing moved but the wind. He lowered his rifle slightly and crab-walked toward the blood. The trail was erratic. The prints surrounding the red stains were not human. They were massive paw prints, dragging slightly on the right side. A wolf? No. The spacing was wrong. The stride indicated a disciplined animal, fighting through immense pain, trying to maintain a tactical trot. Daniel followed the trail, the adrenaline temporarily overriding the biting cold. Half a mile down into a narrow, sheltered ravine, the tracks terminated beneath the massive, uprooted trunk of a fallen cedar tree. He approached slowly, thumbing the selector switch of his rifle off safety. "Easy," he whispered, his voice instantly swallowed by the wind. From the shadows of the root system came a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the wild, frantic snarl of a cornered beast. It was a deep, chest-rattling warning of a disciplined warrior. As Daniel leaned in, his eyes adjusted to the gloom. Lying in the frozen dirt, panting heavily, was a massive black and tan German shepherd. But it was what the dog was wearing that made Daniel's blood run cold. The animal was strapped into a custom-fitted, titanium-reinforced K9 tactical harness, equipped with a strobe mount and an infrared camera. Stitched into the side of the Kevlar webbing was a faded trident patch and the designation K-114. Titan. Daniel breathed, lowering his weapon completely. Titan was a legend within the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He belonged to Petty Officer First Class Ryan Cassidy, a handler from Charlie Platoon who had been operating in the valley over. If Titan was here, alone and bleeding out in the snow, it meant Charlie Platoon had been hit too. Daniel stripped off his gloves, ignoring the stinging cold, and slid under the roots. The dog's eyes were glassy, tracking Daniel's every movement with a mixture of exhaustion and ingrained suspicion. "Easy, buddy. It's Bram. You know me," Daniel murmured, keeping his voice low and steady, offering the back of his hand for the dog to scent. Titan gave a weak sniff, exhaling a puff of white vapor, and rested his heavy head on his paws. He remembered the scent from the barracks at Dam Neck. Daniel ran his hands expertly over the dog's muscular frame. The source of the blood was a clean through-and-through gunshot wound to Titan's left hindquarter. The bullet had missed the bone, but it had torn through a significant amount of muscle, and the cold was the only thing keeping the dog from bleeding out completely. "All right, buddy," "I've got you," Daniel said, pulling his individual first aid kit, IFAK, from his chest rig. He packed the entry and exit wounds with hemostatic gauze. Titan flinched, a sharp whine escaping his throat, but the dog didn't snap. His discipline held. Daniel wrapped a pressure bandage tight around the thigh, securing it with medical tape. As Daniel finished the wrap, he noticed something strange. The K9 harness had been tampered with. The heavy-duty buckles on the left side were scored with deep knife marks, as if someone had tried to cut the harness off the dog in a hurry but had been violently interrupted. Daniel looked at the blood trail leading back out of the cave. The dog hadn't just escaped an ambush, he had fought his way out of someone's grip. But why would enemy insurgents care about taking a dog's harness? The temperature plummeted further as twilight painted the sky in bruising shades of purple and black. Daniel knew they couldn't stay under the root system. The wind was shifting, and the cold would kill Titan before dawn. Even if the blood loss didn't. He managed to coax the massive German shepherd onto his feet. Titan swayed, leaning his heavy side against Daniel's leg for support. Together, the wounded seal and the crippled K9 limped deeper into the ravine, eventually finding a small, natural fissure in the rock face that opened into a shallow cave. It provided total cover from the wind and aerial surveillance. Daniel gathered dry pine needles and deadwood from the deep recesses of the cave. Using magnesium shavings and a fire starter, he built a small, smokeless Dakota fire pit to generate just enough heat to stave off frostbite. He unzipped his own insulated parka and draped half of it over the shivering dog, huddling close to share body heat. As the faint glow of the embers illuminated the small space, Daniel began to meticulously inspect Titan's gear. He needed to know what had happened to Cassidy and Charlie Platoon. He reached for the waterproof admin pouch attached to the top of Titan's harness, hoping to find a beacon or a set of casualty cards. As his hand brushed the Velcro, Titan, despite his injuries, snapped his jaws shut, missing Daniel's wrist by millimeters. Daniel recoiled, shocked. "Hey, stand down," he ordered, using the harsh, authoritative tone handlers used. Titan didn't relax. The dog dragged himself over the pouch, covering it with his chest, looking up at Daniel with hard, unyielding eyes. It was a direct act of defiance, something a Tier 1 dog was trained never to do to a friendly operator. Titan wasn't just wearing the harness, he was guarding it with his life. "What are you hiding, buddy?" Daniel whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ration bar, breaking off a piece. He tossed it to the side. Titan watched the food land, licked his chops, but didn't move an inch. Daniel sighed. He didn't want to wrestle a wounded, 90-pound killing machine. But they were running out of time. "Titan, leave it," Daniel commanded firmly. He slowly reached out, keeping his eyes locked with the dog's, establishing dominance. He placed his hand on Titan's neck, applying a gentle but firm pressure. "Good boy, easy." Reluctantly, letting out a long, low whine, Titan shifted his weight just enough for Daniel to access the pouch. Daniel unzipped it. Inside, there were no casualty cards. There was no standard issue beacon. Instead, nestled in a layer of shock-absorbent foam, was a heavily encrypted, biometric solid-state drive. Attached to the drive was a blood-stained, handwritten note on water-resistant write-in-the-rain paper. Daniel held the note to the firelight. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Cassidy's. The note read, "Bram, if you or anyone finds this, do not trust command." The ambush wasn't a leak. It was a flush. They weren't after the HVT. They were after what's on this drive. "Hayes sold us out. Trust no one on comms. Get the dog out. Get the drive to the Inspector General." Daniel felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes was their intelligence officer. Back at Bagram, he was the man who had briefed Daniel's team for Operation Avalanche. He was the one who had drawn the routes, set the extraction points, and managed the communication frequencies. The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity, the RPG hitting the tail rotor at the exact moment of insertion. The fact that the enemy forces had immediately swarmed the crash site instead of taking cover, and Charlie Platoon Cassidy's team, they had been tasked with a supposed recon mission near a localized communication hub the night before. Cassidy must have downloaded something from that hub. Something highly classified, implicating Hayes, or whoever Hayes was working for. When Hayes realized Cassidy had the data, he used the missions as a cover to wipe out both platoons. Daniel looked down at Titan. The dog wasn't just a survivor. He was a courier. Cassidy had strapped the drive to his dog, given him an extraction command, and likely died providing covering fire so Titan could escape. The knife marks on the harness the PMC mercenaries working for Hayes had tracked Titan, cornered him, and tried to cut the drive off him. Titan had fought back, taken a bullet to the leg, and escaped into the storm. "You're a good boy, Titan," Daniel said softly, his voice tight with suppressed rage. He zipped the drive into his own breast pocket, right over his heart. "We're going to make them pay for Cassidy. But first, we have to survive the night." By 0400 hours, the blizzard abruptly stopped. The deafening howl of the wind was replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. The temperature had dropped to a deadly -30. Daniel kicked dirt over the dying embers of the fire. The smoke would be a beacon now that the sky was clear. He checked Titan's bandage. The bleeding had stopped, and the dog seemed marginally stronger, though he was heavily favoring 3 legs. "Time to move." K-114, Daniel whispered, slinging his Mech 18. They stepped out of the cave into a world painted in blinding silver moonlight. The snow was untouched, a pristine canvas that would record every step they took. Daniel knew they had to find hardball terrain rocks, frozen streams, anything to mask their tracks. They had been moving for 20 minutes, navigating a treacherous ridgeline, when Daniel's instincts flared. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Titan stopped abruptly, his ears swiveling forward like radar dishes, a low, silent growl vibrating in his chest. Daniel dropped to the snow, pulling Titan down with him behind a jagged outcrop of shale. He brought his rifle to his shoulder and peered through the thermal optic. A mile down the valley, moving with terrifying speed and precision, were 4 heat signatures. They weren't local Taliban fighters. They weren't disorganized insurgents. They were moving in a textbook diamond formation, sweeping the tree lines, bounding from cover to cover. They were wearing specialized winter camouflage, and even through the thermal, Daniel could see the distinct silhouettes of modified suppressed SCAR-H rifles and night vision panoramas. Private military contractors, highly trained, heavily armed, and hunting them. Daniel slowly reached down and unclipped the encrypted radio he had salvaged from his downed chopper. He hadn't turned it on, knowing the signal could be triangulated, but he needed to confirm his suspicions. He plugged his earpiece in, switched the dial to a passive scan mode, and waited. A few seconds later, a crisp, American-accented voice cracked over the secure tactical frequency, a frequency only high-level command should possess. Viper 1 to base. We have fresh tracks. Single bipedal. 1 canine. Target is crippled. Moving north, toward the extraction ridge. ETA, to contact. 15 mics. Then, the response. The voice made Daniel's grip on his rifle tighten until his knuckles turned white under his gloves. It was Lieutenant Commander Hayes. Copy, Viper 1. Priority is the package on the dog. I repeat, the K9 is the primary objective. The SEAL is expendable. Terminate with extreme prejudice and recover the drive. Do not let them cross the ridgeline. Daniel killed the radio. The betrayal was absolute. There would be no extraction chopper coming for him. No quick reaction force. Just 4 elite killers closing the distance in the snow. He looked at Titan. The dog was watching the valley, his muscles coiled tight, ignoring the agony in his leg. He was ready to fight. Listen to me, Daniel whispered, pulling a flashbang and a fragmentation grenade from his webbing. They think we're running. They think we're prey. Daniel checked his magazine, slamming it back into the mag well with a solid click. He chambered around. We don't run, Daniel said, his eyes turning cold as the ice around them. We're going to set a trap. We're going to let them get close. And then, buddy, we are going to introduce them to the ghosts of Charlie Platoon. Daniel began to move, but this time, he wasn't heading away from the mercenaries. He was flanking them, moving to the high ground above a narrow choke point in the rocks that the PMCs would be forced to use to follow the tracks. He deliberately dragged his boots, making the trail obvious, before hooking right and scaling an icy ledge. He positioned Titan in a small depression behind him. "Stay," he commanded. Titan lay flat, invisible in the snow. 10 minutes later, the soft crunch, crunch, crunch of boots on snow echoed through the frigid air. The 4 PMCs moved into the choke point below Daniel's position. They were professionals, weapons raised, heads on swivels, communicating with silent hand signals. The point man, a hulking figure in a white ghillie suit, stopped. Looking down at the exaggerated tracks Daniel had left, he knelt, touching the snow, and raised a fist to halt the squad. Daniel pulled the pin on the fragmentation grenade. He didn't throw it immediately. He held the spoon down, counting in his head. 1, 2, 3. He dropped it straight down over the ledge. The grenade landed silently in the deep snow, dead center of the diamond formation. The point man saw the hole in the snow, his eyes widening behind his night vision goggles. Grenna! The explosion shattered the silence of the mountains, a deafening roar of fire, shrapnel, and vaporized snow. The concussive shockwave of the M67 fragmentation grenade slammed into the narrow rock walls, tearing the frozen air apart. A geyser of pulverized snow, shattered shale, and crimson mist erupted from the choke point. The deafening echo rolled down the Hindu Kush Valley like thunder, immediately followed by the eerie, muffled patter of falling ice and dirt. Daniel didn't wait for the dust to settle. Operating on pure muscle memory and combat instinct, he crested the icy ledge, his Mk-18 rifle tucked tight into his shoulder. The thermal optic cut through the swirling snow cloud. 2 of the PMCs were down and completely still, their heat signatures already beginning to pool into the frozen earth. The third was thrashing wildly in the snow, his white ghillie suit ruined, screaming as he clutched at the shrapnel wounds, shredding his lower extremities. But it was the 4th man, the point man, who had spotted the trap a fraction of a second too late that commanded Daniel's immediate attention. He had managed to dive behind a jagged outcropping of limestone just as the grenade detonated. Before Daniel could acquire a clean line of sight, a suppressed burst of 7.62 millimeters rounds chewed through the ice mere inches from his face. Shards of frozen rock sprayed across Daniel's ballistic goggles as he threw himself flat against the ledge. The PMC was a professional. He wasn't panicking. He was laying down precise, suppressive fire, trying to fix Daniel in place while he evaluated his tactical options. Contact front. The surviving PMC barked into his comms, his voice echoing up the cliffside. Echo 2 and 3 are KIA. Echo 4 is combat ineffective. Taking fire from the high ground, Daniel popped out from the left side of the ledge, firing 2 controlled bursts. The 5.56 round sparked against the limestone boulder, pinning the PMC down. But Daniel was running low on ammunition, and the angle was against him. The PMC was in a defensible crater, and worse, he was calling for backup. Suddenly, a cylindrical object arced over the boulder, landing with a soft thud on the ledge right next to Daniel. A flashbang. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut and turned his head, opening his mouth to equalize the pressure. Crack. The blinding flash of light and ear-splitting pop momentarily disoriented him. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. The PMC used the distraction instantly. He broke from cover, abandoning his wounded teammate, and began rapidly scaling the steep, icy incline to flank Daniel's position. He moved with terrifying speed, his scar H leveled, anticipating the blinded seal. Daniel, blinking away the dark spots dancing in his vision, struggled to bring his rifle to bear. He was a second too slow. The PMC crested the ledge, his weapon sweeping directly toward Daniel's chest. "Drop it," the mercenary roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. From the snowy depression 10 yards behind Daniel, a black and tan blur exploded. Titan had defied the stay command. The 90-pound German shepherd, running on 3 legs and fueled by a ferocious protective instinct, launched himself through the air. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He hit the PMC like a fur-covered missile. Titan's powerful jaws clamped down securely around the mercenary's firing arm, driving his canine teeth straight through the insulated winter gear and deep into muscle and tendon. The sheer kinetic force of the 90-pound dog hitting him at full momentum threw the PMC off balance. The Scar H discharged wildly into the sky as the man screamed, a sound of pure agony and shock. The PMC crashed backward into the snow, thrashing desperately, punching at Titan's ribs with his free hand. But a Tier 1 working dog does not let go. Titan aggressively shook his head, driving his teeth deeper. Thrashing the man's arm to neutralize the weapon, Daniel seized the opening. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 2 strides. He didn't fire, not wanting to risk hitting Titan in the chaotic struggle. Instead, Daniel drew his fixed-blade combat knife from his chest rig. The PMC, realizing he was about to die, reached for his sidearm with his left hand. Daniel kicked the man's hand away, dropped a knee heavily onto his chest plate, and drove the knife deep into the vulnerable gap between the man's body armor and collarbone. The mercenary gasped, his eyes going wide beneath his night vision goggles. He choked once, his body going rigid, before going completely slack in the snow. "Os. Titan, os," Daniel commanded, his voice breathless but firm. Titan instantly released the man's shredded arm. The dog backed away, panting heavily, a smear of fresh blood on his muzzle. He limped in a tight circle, his wounded hind leg trembling violently, before collapsing into a sitting position in the snow. He looked up at Daniel, his ears pinned back, expecting to be corrected for breaking his holding command. Daniel wiped his blade on the dead man's ghillie suit and sheathed it. He dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the massive dog's neck, burying his face in the thick fur. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of adrenaline and profound gratitude. "Good boy. Titan. You saved my life." Titan let out a soft whine, leaning his heavy head against Daniel's shoulder. Daniel knew they had mere minutes before Commander Hayes realized Viper 1 was permanently offline. He quickly moved down the slope to the kill zone. The third PMC, the one who had taken the shrapnel, had bled out in the snow. Daniel began to systematically strip the bodies of anything useful. He took 2 fully loaded magazines for his Mach 18, a specialized trauma kit that was vastly superior to his standard IFAK, 3 protein blocks, and a military-grade thermal space blanket. But the most valuable prize was strapped to the chest of the squad leader Titan had taken down. It was a ruggedized tactical tablet, wired into a heavy-duty satellite uplink. Daniel unclipped the tablet and powered the screen on. It bypassed a lock screen, already open to a localized topographical map application used by the mercenaries. A pulsing blue dot marked their current location. A red route line snaked down the mountain, ending at a waypoint marked Fob Viper. LZ. Omega. Daniel zoomed in on the waypoint. It wasn't the main Allied base at Bagram. It was a decommissioned Soviet listening post tucked into a blind valley, roughly 12 miles west of their current position. It was completely off the books. Commander Hayes wasn't coordinating this betrayal from the safety of a command center hundreds of miles away. He was right here, in their backyard, waiting for the PMCs to bring him the drive. Daniel looked at the biometric drive secured safely in his chest pocket. The drive that cost Ryan Cassidy his life. "Change of plans, buddy," Daniel said, looking back at the exhausted K9. "We aren't running to the extraction point. We're taking the fight to them." The sun crested the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, casting long, blindingly white shadows across the valley. The temperature rose marginally, but the biting wind returned, whipping the top layer of snow into a stinging, ground-level blizzard. Survival had shifted from a sprint to a grueling marathon. The adrenaline from the ambush had completely evaporated from Daniel's system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull him into the snow with every step. Titan was faring worse. The fight with the PMC had taken a severe toll. The dog's injured leg had started bleeding again, leaving small, intermittent red dots in the snow. His head hung low, and his heavy tail was tucked tightly between his legs. The proud, aggressive, tactical athlete from Dam Neck was running on fumes and sheer loyalty. They needed shelter to regroup and perform proper medical triage, or neither of them would make it off the mountain. By mid-morning, Daniel spotted a small, dilapidated stone structure clinging to the side of a steep ravine. It was an abandoned shepherd's hut, a relic from an older war, half buried in a snowdrift. Daniel pushed the rotting wooden door open, sweeping the dark, musty interior with his rifle. It was empty, smelling faintly of old dung and wet earth. It was freezing, but it was out of the wind. He ushered Titan inside and immediately sealed the door. Using the thermal blanket he had scavenged, he created a makeshift tent in the corner of the small room to trap what little body heat they had. "All right, Titan. Down. Let me see it," Daniel instructed softly, pulling the looted trauma kit from his pack. Titan collapsed onto the dirt floor with a heavy sigh, laying flat on his side and offering his wounded leg. Daniel cut away the blood-soaked bandages. The wound was angry and swollen, the muscle tissue raw. It needed to be closed before infection set in or the blood loss became critical. He dug through the trauma kit and pulled out a bottle of saline, a sterile surgical stapler, and a blister pack of strong combat analgesics. "This is going to suck, buddy," Daniel murmured. He crushed 2 of the analgesic pills between 2 rocks, mixed the powder with a few drops of water from his canteen, and rubbed the paste directly onto Titan's gums. It wouldn't kill the pain completely, but it would dull the edge. He waited 5 minutes, then flushed the wound with the freezing cold saline. Titan let out a sharp yelp and tried to pull his leg away. "Hold! Titan, hold!" Daniel commanded, locking his arm over the dog's hip to keep him still. He quickly positioned the surgical stapler over the torn muscle tissue. Click! 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 He drove 5 heavy metal staples into the dog's flesh, physically pulling the wound closed. Titan whined pitifully, a high-pitched sound that broke Daniel's heart, burying his nose beneath his paws. "I'm sorry. I know. It's done. You're a good boy," Daniel soothed, wrapping a fresh, dry pressure bandage over the staples. He stroked the dog's ears, feeling the coarse fur between his fingers. As Titan rested, drifting into a medically induced sleep, Daniel turned his attention back to the ruggedized tablet. He needed to understand the enemy's disposition. He booted the tablet back up and began digging through the localized command structure files left open by the PMC leader. What he found painted a terrifying picture. The PMCs weren't just a rogue squad. They were part of a massive, heavily funded private military corporation called Blackbridge Logistics. And according to the encrypted manifest logs on the tablet, Blackbridge wasn't here to fight the Taliban. They were here to steal. Daniel pieced together the fragments of data. A massive deposit of raw, weapons-grade lithium and rare earth minerals had been discovered deep in a contested valley, right under the nose of the local government. Commander Hayes had fabricated intelligence to deploy SEAL teams to clear the valley of insurgents. Once the SEALs did the dirty work, Hayes intended to wipe them out, claiming they were ambushed, leaving the valley wide open for Blackbridge to move in and secure the multi-billion-dollar mining rights without U.S. oversight. Cassidy and his dog must have stumbled onto a Blackbridge communication relay and downloaded the entire operational blueprint, including the bank transfers linking Hayes directly to the PMC's payroll. "That's what's on the drive," Daniel whispered to himself in the dim light of the hut. Proof of a Black Ops resource heist. If Hayes got the drive, the deaths of Charlie Platoon would be officially recorded as tragic casualties of war. Hayes would retire a very rich man, and the PMCs would strip the valley bare. Daniel looked at the time on the tablet. It was 1,400 hours. The battery was at 12%. He zoomed in on Fob Viper. The satellite imagery showed a fortified compound surrounded by razor wire, complete with a helipad and a motor pool. The data logs indicated there were roughly 30 heavily armed Blackbridge contractors stationed there, acting as Hayes' personal Praetorian guard. Daniel was one man, armed with a rifle and half a combat load, accompanied by a crippled dog. Assaulting a fortified position held by 30 elite mercenaries was tactical suicide. It was the definition of an unwinnable scenario. But as Daniel looked at the sleeping form of Titan, he thought of Cassidy. He thought of the men in his own squad, who had burned in the Black Hawk. He felt the solid weight of the biometric drive resting over his heart. He didn't have to win a war. He just had to get to the communication array inside Fob Viper and broadcast the contents of the drive to U.S. Central Command on an open, unencrypted frequency. Once the data was in the wind, Hayes's plan would crumble, and the U.S. military would rain hellfire down on the Blackbridge compound. It was a suicide mission. But it was the only way to ensure the ghosts of Operation Avalanche got their justice. Daniel spent the next 2 hours meticulously prepping his gear. He loaded his magazines, checking every individual round. He tied strips of the white thermal blanket to his rifle and helmet for improvised camouflage. He broke off the last piece of the protein bar and fed it to Titan. By 1600 hours, the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting the valley into deep, shadowy gloom. It was time. Up, Titan, Daniel said. The dog struggled to his feet. He tested his stapled leg, grimacing, but put a fraction of his weight on it. The painkillers were working. His eyes, though lined with exhaustion, were alert. They left the shepherd's hut, stepping back out into the freezing wilderness. They moved in silence, a man and his dog, traversing the brutal terrain with a singular, deadly focus. 2 hours later, they crawled to the edge of a snow-covered precipice. Below them lay the blind valley, shrouded in darkness. In the center of the depression, lit up by harsh halogen floodlights, sat Fob Viper. Daniel raised his thermal optics. He could see patrols walking the perimeter. He saw a heavily armored SUV idling near the main gate, and in the center of the compound, bristling with antennas, was the communications building. But what made Daniel's blood run cold was the sight on the helipad. A sleek, unmarked civilian helicopter was spinning its rotors, the downwash kicking up a massive cloud of snow. Standing near the open side door, flanked by 4 PMCs, was a man in a pristine winter coat, Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes. He was preparing to leave. Daniel knew if Hayes got on that bird, the drive's evidence might not be enough to pull him out of whatever non-extradition country he was fleeing to. "We're out of time," Daniel whispered, clicking his weapon off safety. "We go loud." The civilian helicopter's turbines whined to a deafening crescendo, the sound slicing through the frigid mountain air. From his vantage point on the snow-covered precipice, Daniel Bramlett watched through the thermal optic of his MiG-18. The downwash from the rotors whipped the fresh powder into a localized blizzard around the helipad. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hayes, wrapped in an expensive, fur-lined parka that looked entirely out of place in a war zone, ducked his head and moved toward the open side door of the aircraft, flanked by his private security detail. Daniel's breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped to a steady, rhythmic thump. The bone-deep exhaustion, the freezing temperatures, the ache in his muscles, all of it faded into the background. He was back in the zone, operating in the hyper-focused reality of Tier 1 combat. "They're leaving, buddy," Daniel whispered, his breath pluming in the dark. Titan lay beside him, his ears pinned flat against his skull. The German shepherd's eyes were locked on the flashing strobe lights of the helicopter. He didn't whine or move, understanding the silent tension of the impending assault. Daniel knew he couldn't hit the pilot through the armored glass from this angle and distance, nor could he rely on taking out Hayes surrounded by 4 heavily armed mercenaries. But he didn't need to kill Hayes right now. He just needed to ground him. He shifted his aim slightly to the rear of the aircraft. The tail rotor of the sleek, black civilian transport was spinning furiously. It was a complex, fragile assembly of gears, drive shafts, and composite blades, and it was completely unarmored. Daniel dialed in his windage, compensating for the crosswind tearing through the valley. He exhaled half a breath and held it. Crack, crack, crack. 3 suppressed 5.56mm rounds spat from the barrel of the Mk-18. The tracer rounds, invisible to the naked eye but glaringly bright in his night vision optics, streaked across the dark expanse of the valley. The impacts were instantaneous. Sparks showered violently from the tail boom as the high-velocity rounds shattered the exposed gearbox housing. On the helipad, chaos erupted. The helicopter shrieked as the mechanical failure tore through the drivetrain. Deprived of its anti-torque control, the fuselage violently snapped to the right. The pilot, caught completely off guard, panicked and cut the collective, slamming the heavy aircraft back down onto the tarmac. The landing skids buckled with a sickening crunch. The main rotor blades dipped dangerously low, one of them striking a nearby mobile floodlight. The composite blade shattered like glass, sending lethal chunks of shrapnel flying across the pad. The 4 PMCs surrounding Hayes immediately tackled the commander to the ground, shielding him with their bodies as debris rained down. "Target disabled," Daniel muttered, immediately shifting his rifle to a new target. The base was instantly on high alert. Sirens wailed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the damaged, dying helicopter engine. Floodlights snapped to life, their bright beams sweeping the dark tree lines surrounding FOB Viper. Men poured out of the barracks, weapons raised, shouting commands over the radio network. Daniel needed a distraction to breach the perimeter wire without being immediately concentrated on by 30 rifles. He scanned the motor pool adjacent to the helipad. Parked next to a row of armored SUVs was a large, olive-drab fuel bowser, used to top off the generators and vehicles. He swapped his magazine, loading one of the PMC mags he had scavenged the ones he knew were loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. He aimed center mass at the massive cylindrical tank. Crack, crack, crack. The incendiary rounds punched through the thin steel of the fuel bowser. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the vapor inside ignited. The explosion was biblical. A massive fireball erupted into the night sky, painting the snow-covered valley in brilliant shades of orange and hellish red. The concussive wave knocked men off their feet 100 yards away. Secondary explosions rippled through the motor pool as the armored SUVs caught fire, their tires blowing out like cannon shots. Thick, black, acrid smoke began to billow across the compound, plunging half the base into chaotic darkness. "Let's move," Daniel commanded. He pushed himself up, sprinting down the steep, icy embankment. Titan was right beside him. Despite the stapled wound in his hind leg, the dog moved with terrifying grace, his adrenaline masking the pain. They hit the tree line at the base of the valley and melted into the shadows just outside the perimeter razor wire. Daniel pulled a pair of heavy wire cutters from his rig and rapidly snipped a narrow opening through the concertina wire. He slid through the gap, snow packing into his collar, and signaled for Titan to follow. They were inside the wire. The heat from the burning motor pool washed over them, a stark contrast to the sub-zero air. The smell of burning diesel and melted rubber was overpowering. Blackbridge contractors were sprinting past them in the gloom, completely focused on the inferno and the downed helicopter, shouting frantically into their headsets. "Perimeter breach. We have a perimeter breach," a voice crackled over the scavenged radio earpiece Daniel wore. "Sector 4 is compromised. Find them." Daniel moved methodically between the shadows of the prefabricated storage containers, his weapon sweeping every corner. He was a ghost in the smoke. A lone PMC rounded a corner not 10 feet away, his rifle raised, scanning the darkness. Before the mercenary could process the silhouette of the SEAL, Daniel signaled with 2 fingers. Titan lunged from the shadows. There was no growl, no warning, just the sheer kinetic force of a 90-pound predator. Titan hit the man in the chest, driving him backward into the corrugated steel wall of the container. The PMC gasped, dropping his rifle as Titan's jaws clamped over his shoulder harness, pinning him in place. Daniel stepped forward, driving the stock of his Mach 18 into the man's temple. The PMC went limp instantly. "Aus. Heel," Daniel whispered. Titan released his grip, spitting out a piece of Kevlar, and fell in perfectly at Daniel's left knee. Through the thick, roiling smoke, Daniel could see his objective. The communications building. It was a reinforced concrete bunker sitting dead center in the compound, bristling with satellite dishes and encrypted radio masts. It was the only building heavily guarded. 2 PMCs stood at the heavy steel door, their rifles trained outward, unmoving despite the chaos consuming the rest of the base. Daniel checked his magazine. He had 15 rounds left in his primary weapon, his sidearm, and the encrypted drive burning a hole in his chest pocket. He took a deep breath of the smoke-filled air. The element of surprise was fading. It was time to kick the door in. The concrete walls of the communications bunker were thick enough to withstand a mortar strike. The 2 heavily armed sentries guarding the reinforced steel door were Blackbridge elites, their night vision goggles scanning the smoke-filled courtyard. They weren't flinching at the secondary explosions rocking the motor pool. Their sole focus was protecting the data relay. Daniel knew he couldn't engage them from a distance. The moment he fired, he would highlight his position to the entire base, and the heavy door would be locked down from the inside. He needed to get within striking distance. He looked down at Titan. The dog was panting, a thin line of blood seeping through the bandage on his leg. "I need you to hold the line, buddy," Daniel whispered, pressing his forehead against the dog's cold nose. "Wait for the flash." Daniel unclipped his last flashbang grenade. He crept behind the blackened husk of an incinerated transport truck, putting him a mere 20 yards from the bunker doors. He pulled the pin, mentally calculating the fuse. He needed it to detonate in the air, right at their eye level. To maximize the blinding effect, he threw it hard, an underhand toss that sent the cylindrical canister arching through the thick black smoke. "Grenade!" one of the sentries yelled, his training kicking in as he turned away and dropped. The flashbang detonated with an ear-splitting crack, lighting up the courtyard in a blinding white strobe. Daniel broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground. He didn't fire his rifle. He kept it tucked, prioritizing speed. As the blinding light faded, the standing sentry was stumbling backward, clutching his ears. Daniel slammed into him, driving his combat knife upward under the man's body armor, twisting the blade and pulling it free in one fluid, brutal motion. The second sentry, recovering from his dive, raised his Scar H from his knees. Before he could pull the trigger, a black blur cleared the hood of the burnt truck. Titan, perfectly executing the delayed command, hit the kneeling mercenary like a freight train. The dog's jaws locked onto the man's forearm, ripping the weapon away and dragging the heavy contractor face first into the frozen dirt. Daniel stepped over the struggling pair, leveling his sidearm, and put 2 suppressed rounds into the mercenary's chest plate, ending the fight instantly. "Good boy. Inside, now," Daniel ordered, grabbing the heavy handle of the steel door. It was unlocked. He hauled the door open and threw himself into the room, his rifle raised. The interior of the comms bunker was bathed in the cool blue glow of server racks and massive monitor arrays. The air conditioning hummed loudly, a stark contrast to the burning world outside. There was only one technician inside, a panicked man in a polo shirt desperately trying to wipe a hard drive with a magnetic wand. He froze as Daniel's laser sight painted a red dot dead center on his forehead. "Step away from the console," Daniel commanded, his voice cold as ice. "Do it now, or you're dead." The technician dropped the wand, throwing his hands up, and backed away until he hit the server racks. Daniel moved to the primary terminal. It was an advanced military uplink, tied directly to the Department of Defense's secure satellite network. He unzipped his chest pocket, his fingers slick with sweat and snow, and pulled out the blood-stained biometric solid-state drive that Cassidy had died to protect. He slammed the drive into the heavy-duty port on the console. The screen immediately flashed a red warning. "Encrypted hardware detected. Authorization required." "How do I bypass the local firewall?" Daniel barked at the technician, not taking his eyes off the screen. "You can't," the man stammered, his eyes darting to the door. "It's a closed-loop system. Commander Hayes has the only administrator key." Daniel cursed under his breath. He pulled out the ruggedized tablet he had looted from the PMC leader earlier. He connected the tablet to the terminal with a USB-C cable. He wasn't a cyber warfare specialist, but he knew how to use the brute force hacking scripts loaded onto Blackbridge's own devices. He initiated a local override, using the PMC's command credentials to trick the server into accepting the external drive. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Decrypting and establishing secure uplink. 10%. Suddenly, the heavy steel door behind them shuddered violently. A barrage of high-caliber rounds slammed into the metal, the deafening impacts echoing inside the concrete bunker. They were trapped. "Bramlet," Commander Hayes' voice boomed from a megaphone outside, dripping with venom. "I know you're in there. You and that mutt. It's over. You have nowhere to go." Daniel ignored him. He dragged a heavy steel desk in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. 35%. "You think anyone is going to believe a dead seal over me?" Hayes continued, his voice echoing through the courtyard. I'm a decorated officer. You're a rogue operator who cracked under pressure and murdered his own team. That's the official story, Daniel. And I have 30 men out here ready to write the ending. Watch the door, Titan, Daniel said. The German shepherd limped to the barricade, his hackles raised. A low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. The dog was bleeding heavily now. The staples in his leg straining under the immense physical toll. 60%. Blow the hinges. Hayes barked outside. Daniel grabbed the terrified technician by the collar and shoved him behind a row of server racks. Keep your head down, he ordered. Daniel took cover behind the main console, resting his Mauk 18 on the edge of the desk. He had 1 magazine left, 30 rounds to hold off an army. A shaped C4 charge detonated against the steel door. The explosion blew the heavy barricade backward, sending the steel desk skidding across the floor. The door swung open, hanging drunkenly off its ruined hinges. Thick smoke poured into the pristine blue room. Through the smoke stepped 3 heavy breachers, their ballistic shields raised, moving in a tactical wedge. Behind them, obscured by the shields, was Commander Hayes, an assault rifle clutched in his hands. Daniel opened fire. He aimed low, skipping 5.56 millimeters rounds off the concrete floor, under the ballistic shields, tearing into the legs of the breachers. The point man screamed, his knee shattering, and collapsed, dropping his shield. Daniel instantly shifted his fire, putting 2 rounds into the gap left by the fallen shield, taking down the second breacher. But there were too many. The third breacher pushed forward, laying down a wall of suppressive fire that chewed the main console to pieces. Shards of plastic and sparks showered over Daniel as he was forced to duck hard. 85%. Kill the dog, Hayes screamed from the doorway. The remaining breacher turned his weapon toward Titan. Daniel lunged from behind the console, completely exposing himself, firing his sidearm wildly to draw their fire. A bullet grazed his left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. But it was enough. The breacher flinched, his shots going wide. Titan didn't retreat. With a final, agonizing roar, the crippled dog threw himself at the breacher, locking his jaws around the man's throat just above the body armor. They crashed to the floor in a mess of blood and tactical gear. Daniel scrambled back to the console, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked up at the screen. 99%. Upload complete. Packets transmitted to CENTCOM secure server. The screen flashed green. The data the bank transfers, the fabricated intelligence, the video logs of the ambush was out. It was bouncing off military satellites, landing directly on the desks of the Inspector General and the Joint Chiefs. No, Hayes screamed. He stepped over the thrashing breacher and leveled his rifle directly at Daniel's chest. The commander's face was twisted in absolute rage. He knew it was over. His fortune, his career, his life gone in a matter of seconds. You ruined everything, Hayes roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. Daniel stared down the barrel of the gun, exhausted, bleeding, out of ammo, but a grim smile touched his lips. No, Commander, Daniel said quietly. Charlie Platoon did. Before Hayes could pull the trigger, the deafening roar of a jet engine shattered the airspace above the valley. It wasn't a civilian transport helicopter. It was the unmistakable, earth-shaking scream of an F-22 Raptor tearing through the atmosphere, immediately followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of approaching AH-64 Apache gunships. Central Command had received the data, and they were already here. The trap had finally closed, but this time, Hayes was the one caught inside. The sonic boom of the F-22 Raptor was a physical blow, a concussive shockwave that shattered the remaining floodlights and sent a terrifying tremor through the reinforced concrete of the communications bunker. It was a show of force maneuver, a low-altitude flyby designed to disorient and paralyze the enemy. The sky above Fob Viper, previously dark and snowing, was suddenly illuminated by a brilliant, cascading shower of thermal flares deployed by the fighter jet, turning the night into blinding daylight. Before the deafened PMCs in the courtyard could even raise their weapons to the sky, the true executioners arrived. 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, running completely blacked out on stealth approach, crested the ridgeline. They didn't issue warnings. They didn't ask for surrender. Central Command had seen the decrypted files. They knew exactly what Blackbridge and Commander Hayes were. The Apaches opened up with their 30mm M230 chain guns. The sound was a terrifying, mechanical roar like a giant tearing thick canvas. High-explosive dual-purpose rounds rained down on the PMC perimeter, obliterating the armored SUVs, shredding the remaining anti-air emplacements, and turning the frozen courtyard into a churning nightmare of fire and shrapnel. Inside the smoke-filled bunker, the sudden arrival of U.S. air support pushed Commander Hayes over the edge of sanity. The realization that his multi-billion-dollar empire of treason had just been incinerated by his own military broke him. "If I'm dead, you're coming with me," Hayes screamed. His face contorted in a mask of pure, unhinged malice. He didn't aim for Daniel's chest plate. He dropped the barrel of his rifle and squeezed the trigger, aiming for Daniel's unprotected legs. Daniel threw himself violently to the right, but a 5.56 round grazed his thigh, tearing through his tactical pants and searing the muscle. He hit the concrete floor hard, his sidearm skittering out of reach beneath a ruined server rack. Hayes stepped forward, racking the bolt of his rifle to clear a jam, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He raised the weapon, placing the muzzle squarely between Daniel's eyes. Game over, Bramlett. But Hayes had forgotten the golden rule of naval special warfare. Never ignore the K-9. Titan, bleeding, exhausted, and running entirely on the fading adrenaline of a deeply ingrained protective instinct, launched himself from the pile of the neutralized breacher. He didn't have the strength for a leaping takedown. Instead, the 90-pound German Shepherd clamped his jaws directly onto Hayes's right ankle, his canine teeth punching straight through the heavy leather combat boot and sinking deep into the Achilles tendon. Hayes shrieked, a high-pitched sound of absolute agony, his finger spasming on the trigger, the rifle discharged, the rounds chewing harmlessly into the ceiling as his leg buckled under the immense crushing force of the dog's jaws. "Get off me." "Get off," Hayes roared, using his free leg to kick viciously at Titan's wounded ribs. Titan let out a strangled whine, blood spraying from his own mouth, but the dog refused to let go. He locked his jaw, violently shaking his heavy head, dragging the rogue commander down to the floor. Daniel didn't hesitate. Ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder and thigh, he lunged forward. He tackled Hayes around the waist, pinning the man's rifle beneath them. Hayes was thrashing wildly, fueled by pure panic, elbowing Daniel in the face and clawing at his tactical vest. Daniel absorbed a brutal strike to his jaw, tasting copper, but he maintained his dominant position. He drew his combat knife from its sheath. As Hayes reached for a sidearm strapped to his drop-leg holster, Daniel brought the heavy pommel of the knife down with devastating force, striking Hayes squarely on the temple. The commander's eyes rolled back, his body going instantly slack against the cold concrete. "Os, Titan, os," Daniel gasped, his chest heaving, his vision blurring at the edges. It took 3 commands before Titan finally released the commander's ruined ankle. The dog collapsed onto his side, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes glassy. The makeshift staples in his leg had torn open during the struggle, and a dark pool of blood was rapidly expanding across the floor. "No, no, no, hey, look at me," Daniel pleaded, dragging himself over to the dog. He stripped off his tactical scarf and pressed it hard against the hemorrhaging wound, applying all his remaining body weight. "You hold on, Titan. Do you hear me? You hold the line." Outside, the roar of the Apaches shifted to a hover as 4 MH-60 Black Hawks descended into the ruined courtyard. Fast ropes dropped, and operators from the 75th Ranger Regiment flooded the compound. The surviving PMCs, realizing they were outgunned by America's premier Tier 1 assets, threw their weapons into the snow and dropped to their knees, hands laced behind their heads. Heavy boots pounded against the concrete as a squad of Rangers breached the bunker, their weapons sweeping the room. "Friendly! Friendly!" Daniel yelled, his voice cracking, keeping his hands visible while pressing down on Titan's wound. "I have a priority alpha casualty. I need a trauma medic right now." A Ranger medic pushed through the squad, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. The dead PMCs, the unconscious commander, the bleeding SEAL, and the dying military working dog. "I've got him, Chief." the medic said, dropping to his knees and immediately pulling a tourniquet and a heavy trauma dressing from his kit. We've got a medevac bird spinning up. You did good. We've got it from here. As the medic worked frantically on Titan, Daniel looked down at the dog's blood on his hands. The adrenaline finally abandoned him, replaced by a suffocating darkness. He slumped against the server rack, the sound of the helicopter rotors fading into a distant, hollow hum as he lost consciousness. The harsh, fluorescent lights of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, were a stark contrast to the blinding white snow of the Hindu Kush. Daniel sat in a sterile waiting room, staring out the window at the gray winter sky. His left arm was in a sling, his shoulder heavily bandaged from the gunshot wound, and he walked with a pronounced limp. 2 weeks had passed since the extraction at FOB Viper. The fallout had been seismic. The data Titan had carried across the frozen mountains had triggered a massive federal investigation. General Kenneth Mackenzie, then serving as commander of United States Central Command, had personally overseen the dismantling of the Blackbridge logistics network. Commander Richard Hayes had been formally charged with treason, espionage, and the murder of 14 U.S. servicemen. He was currently sitting in a maximum security cell at Fort Leavenworth, awaiting a military tribunal that would undoubtedly end in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The deaths of Charlie Platoon and Daniel's own squad were finally given the honors they deserved. They weren't recorded as victims of a tragic ambush, but as heroes who had uncovered a massive internal conspiracy. But Daniel's mind wasn't on the geopolitical fallout or the justice served. It was on the operating theater down the hall. Titan had been airlifted out of Afghanistan in critical condition. He had lost massive amounts of blood, suffered severe frostbite, and the damage to the muscle and bone in his hind leg was catastrophic. A team of the world's best veterinary surgeons had been fighting for hours to save the limb. The heavy double doors of the surgical wing swung open. A lead surgeon in green scrubs, looking utterly exhausted, walked toward Daniel. Daniel stood up, his heart hammering in his chest. "Doc," the surgeon offered a tired, genuine smile. "He's going to make it, Chief Bramlett. We managed to save the leg. The muscle grafts took, and we plated the bone. He's going to have a permanent limp, and his days of jumping out of helicopters are officially over. But he's alive. He's strong." A heavy, suffocating weight lifted off Daniel's chest. He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes as a single, silent tear tracked down his cheek. "Thank you. Thank you, doctor. He's in recovery. He's heavily sedated. But you can go sit with him." Daniel walked into the dimly lit recovery room. Titan lay on a heated bed, hooked up to an IV and a heart monitor. His left leg was encased in a thick, rigid cast. The massive German shepherd looked smaller, vulnerable. Daniel pulled up a chair and gently rested his hand on Titan's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. "You did it, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought the truth home. Cassidy would be so damn proud of you." At the sound of Daniel's voice, Titan's ears twitched. His eyes slowly fluttered open, glassy and unfocused from the anesthesia. He looked at Daniel, let out a long, shuddering sigh, and weakly licked the back of the SEAL's hand. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly over the manicured lawns of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group headquarters at Dam Neck, Virginia. The Atlantic Ocean provided a steady, rhythmic backdrop to the solemn ceremony. Hundreds of operators in dress whites stood at attention. In the front row sat the family of Petty Officer First Class Ryan Cassidy, holding a folded American flag. General Kenneth Mackenzie stood at the podium. "We are gathered today to honor the unbreakable spirit of our Special Operations Forces and the extraordinary loyalty of the animals who serve beside them." Daniel stood at attention near the podium, dressed in his crisp uniform, a Navy cross pinned to his chest. Sitting dutifully by his left leg was Titan. The dog looked healthy, his coat shining in the sun, though he held his injured left leg at a slight angle. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty under the most extreme conditions, General Mackenzie read from a leather-bound citation, "The Dickin Medal, the highest award for valor in military animals, is awarded to K-114, Tactical Working Dog." "Titan." Daniel knelt down. The general stepped forward and gently clipped the prestigious bronze medallion to Titan's collar. Titan gave his tail a slow, methodical wag, leaning his heavy head against Daniel's chest. Furthermore, General Mackenzie continued, a warm smile breaking through his professional demeanor. Upon his official medical retirement from naval special warfare, ownership and care of Titan is hereby transferred to Chief Petty Officer Daniel Bramlett. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the base. Later that afternoon, as the crowds dispersed, Daniel and Titan walked along the sandy shoreline of the base. The ocean breeze was warm, a world away from the freezing hell of the Hindu Kush. Daniel stopped and looked down at the dog. Titan looked back, his intelligent eyes bright, the Dickon medal gleaming on his chest. They were both broken in different ways, carrying the physical and mental scars of a war that most of the world would never know about. But they were alive. "Come on, buddy," Daniel said softly, patting his leg. "Let's go home." Titan barked once, a deep, happy sound, and limped faithfully after his new handler, leaving 2 sets of tracks in the wet sand, side by side, until the tide washed them away. What an incredible journey of survival, loyalty, and ultimate justice. From the freezing mountains of the Hindu Kush to the solemn halls of Walter Reed, Chief Daniel Bramlett and K9 Titan proved that the bond between a soldier and his dog is truly unbreakable. If this story of Titan's bravery and the takedown of a corrupt command had your heart racing, please hit that like button to honor the real-life heroes and working dogs who inspire these tales. Make sure to share this video with anyone who loves a powerful, action-packed story. And subscribe to the channel for more intense, real-world, tactical thrillers. Leave a comment down below what was your favorite moment of Titan's incredible rescue mission. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next mission.